Well, good morning and welcome to the England Green Infrastructure Mapping Database release of version 2.1. Today, our deep dive webinar session for the 5th of November 2024. And we begin with a picture of a couple of surfers. You might wonder, why a picture of a couple of surfers? That's to remind me to say that actually 2.1 is a significant expansion on previous iterations of the mapping. We've got an awful lot of content. If we actually did a deep dive, it would probably take all day. We have an hour and a half, but in an hour and a half, all we can really do is give an introduction to the breadth of the content and what we've done with it over the last couple of years or so. So the surfers are there to remind me that this is less of a deep dive and more of a sort of surfing experience. So if you manage to get your wetsuit on and grab your board, perhaps it's time for us to go surfing these modules. And first of all, I'm going to welcome our presenters today. I'm not alone. We'll be handing over to each other to cover various different modules as we go through the event. So I am Martin Moss, but I'm here today with colleagues David Greenwell, Cora Hamblin and Anne Marsham. But we also welcome a special guest star, Professor Sarah Lindley of the University of Manchester, who's going to go through three of the modules with whom we've been working with her on for the last 18 months, 2 years or so. So quite a lot of work gone into some of the stuff that's coming out. It's taken time to get it ready for publication. But it is being published, and the England GI mapping is supported by both Natural England and the Natural Capital and Ecosystems Assessment Programme. And it's there, it's designed to support the adoption, the understanding, and the evidence for the 5 key headline standards in the England Green Infrastructure Standards Framework. And you'll all know what they are. They'll be tattooed on your arm in case you forget, but just in case you're wearing a long sleeve shirt today, they are related to the development of green infrastructure strategy, and we hope the evidence and the data that we provide is a starting point. It helps you get there. It doesn't do the whole job, but at least it provides a good start in developing the evidence around GI strategy, and in particular to support elements of that strategy which are dedicated to understanding accessible green space, urban nature recovery, urban greening, and urban tree canopy. And you will notice, no doubt, in 2.1, there's still no current content for urban trees. We're hoping to work on something this winter and have it ready maybe for spring, summer next year, but it's kind of got to be right. And we want it specifically related to our headline standards. So no trees yet, but hopefully sometime in the spring. So 2.1, what's in it? The overview. This is the third iteration of the green infrastructure mapping. So 1.1, 1.2, now 2.1. And it's a substantial expansion on previous versions. So we now have about 20 modules and something in the region of 110 different maps. We've managed to update most, but not quite all, the content of 1.2. So the content you will know already. Some of it has had to stay the same. We haven't got around to doing everything, but most of it has been updated. And I've had a lot of questions over the last year or so, 18 months. You know, when are we going to incorporate Census 21? And the answer is now, 2.1. All the content that uses population data uses Census 21 data, and all the LSOAs, MSOAs, etc., are based on the Census 21 outputs. So the new LSOAs in particular are the ones that we use, and there are about 900 new ones in all but one instance, and that's related to IMD, which of course is still 2019. So the components of the mapping are fourfold. First of all, there is the public face of it, the shop frontage, if you like, which is the Green Infrastructure website map portal, where we can see, visualize the underpinning data. There's also a mapping user guide, which is on the site. That describes what you're looking at, hopefully. There are a few glitches we're probably going to have to fix over the coming weeks, but overall it describes what you're looking at and gives you some information about each individual map. There is a data download which is now published, and that's available on the link there on data.gov. We do provide data as a geopackage and a geodatabase. We've had a glitch with the geopackage. It's not there. It will be there as soon as we've managed to create it and get it uploaded. So just bear with us on that one, please. There's also a method statement which describes technically how we did the work, the decisions that we took, how we treated the data, and so on. So if you want to know, the blood, the guts, and the bones of the mapping, then that's the place to be. And it's come out as a Natural England evidence report, available again on this link. And we'll be sending the links around after the event, so you can access the data and you can access the method statement. So surfing experience starts here, module number 1, the Green Infrastructure Assets module, as I call it. We've updated some content. We've created a little bit of new content, and there's some content we haven't yet updated. So the updated content, the old stuff that is now new, I say new, actually it's taken a long time to get 2.1 ready for publication. So some of this data is already starting to look a little old. It's getting on towards 2 years old or so. So as I sit here launching 2.1, we're actually creating version 2.2, and that's due out maybe spring, maybe early summer, hopefully, of next year. So we're updating the update even as we publish the update itself. But that's the nature of the game. The data is constantly moving on, and we're constantly playing a bit of catch up. We've updated the greenest grid as well, and the sharp-eyed amongst you will notice the alignment's changed a little bit. The previous grid we thought was aligned with the OS National Grid. It turned out it wasn't. We don't know why, just an error. So we have realigned it to the OS National Grid this time round. It does mean, unfortunately, however, that the two grids don't quite match. We'll have to live with that. We've updated and expanded the private gardens data, so it now covers all England, including rural, and therefore not just urban. And we've also updated the access points data. There's a couple of new content maps, one of which is concerning area of publicly accessible green infrastructure per 1,000 people. So a measure, if you like, of capacity, not just amounts. That's available in geographies, local nature recovery strategy area, local authority areas, MSOA and LSOA. And we've also added one map for local authority areas and local nature reserve provision per 1,000 people as well. So two new contributions to the asset maps. There's a couple of things we haven't updated. First of all, the land with permissive access. We'd love to get more data on land which private landowners permit public access to. We've got what we've got. It's the same as in 1.2. We're open to new data if anyone out there would like to provide us with some spatial data that we can incorporate and publish under OGL terms and conditions. We'd like to talk to you if you're there. And we haven't done anything to the woodlands and access map, and that's largely because the Forest Commission are undertaking some work at the moment looking at accessible woodlands. We're in conversation with the Forest Commission about when the outputs of that are likely to be available, and when they are, we'll look at what we can incorporate into a future iteration, possibly 2.2, with a bit of luck. So module 2 is the access to green space standards maps, often referred to as the buffers maps. So all these have been updated. We haven't expanded this module, but all 6 accessible green space standards buffers maps have been updated using the accessible green infrastructure data that we have in module 1. Bear in mind that's old, as I've said, a few years old now. But we've also updated the accessible green space standards profile map. That's the map you can see here, where we get to look at where the different standards, the different buffers overlap or don't overlap, as the case may be. And we also updated the major barriers mapping. I'm going to surf over module 3. We'll come back to module 3, don't worry. But module 4 is new. It's basically a cut of the data using another new geography, not a local authority one or statistical one this time, but using the national character areas. So we've created national character area summary statistic maps looking at green space provision, garden space, and locally accessible water site. So that's by amounts and by percentage for each of those. And the green space data in particular, as it is with the amounts per 1,000 population in module 1, splits down into access land, coastal margin, public green spaces, and local nature reserves. So you can see the relative proportions and dominances of different sorts of accessible green infrastructure. Are you dominated by a coastal margin, or public green spaces, or access land, and so on? Likely accessible water side, we call it likely because it's an assessment of probability. It's probably publicly accessible, but it might not be because of the way the method works. We can't actually be 100% sure that it is likely accessible. It is actually accessible. The actual blue infrastructure module hasn't been updated for 2.1. We're doing that right now, so that will be updated in due course. And so, yes, we've surfed over 1 and 2 and 4. Well, what happened to 3? We have to backtrack, catch a wave back to Module 3 to talk about the linear assets. And I'm going to hand over now to my colleague, Cora Hamblin, who's going to tell us what we've been doing with the public rights of way data. So,
Good morning. My name is Cora Hamblin and I work as a data scientist on green infrastructure. Today I'll be talking to you about Module 3, Linear Access, Combined Green Space and Sports and Active Recreation. A significant update within the linear access was updating the public rights of way dataset for the whole of England. We also expanded the coverage for this for 7 highway authorities. These are Darlington, Stoke-on-Trent, Coventry, Brent, Ealing, Havering and Richmond-on-Thames. There are certain areas that lack public rights of way data sets. That is due to publishing restraints where we weren't able to get the permissions to publish under an open government license. The data is out there, so we hope to include it in future updates. We also updated the higher rights density map to a higher resolution of 1 kilometre, where it was previously 5 kilometres. Higher rights is essentially public rights of way excluding footpaths. We also added the National Cycle Network, and this is built by Sustrans and Ordnance Survey, showing the cycle networks within England. Data that we'd like to include for future updates within the linear access would be to reduce the gaps in the public rights of way and access OGL data for areas such as Liverpool, Telford, Newcastle, Sunderland, Wolverhampton, Luton and Croydon. We'd also like to update the experiential quality data, incorporate Living England's Phase 4 habitat classification dataset, so we're able to visualise habitats surrounding the public rights of way areas, and also include additional cycle network datasets from highway authorities. Thank you for listening. I'll now hand over to my colleague David Greenwell to talk about blue infrastructure.
Hello, my name is David Greenwell. I'm a spatial analyst working on the Green Infrastructure Mapping project. I'm going to run through some further updates to the mapping, these being blue infrastructure, coast and access, access to nature close to home, access inequalities mapping, and social statistics. Blue infrastructure. There have been no major updates to our blue infrastructure mapping this time around. However, work is in progress to update these maps for the future release of version 2.2 of the Green Infrastructure Mapping. For this iteration, we have improved the data presentation and formatting, having brought the England level and urban likely accessible waterside maps and statistical maps together to make them easier to understand. We have also been working on collaborative projects with the Rivers Trust and aim to release outputs from these projects in the future. Coast and access. Updates to the coast and access maps have also been limited. We are currently using the 2021 Environment Agency bathing waters data. As such, the maps will not show sites that have been designated since 2021. We aim to update this for version 2.2 of Green Infrastructure Mapping. However, we have updated the King Charles III coast path and margin, adding all sections designated up to March 2024. Foreshore data has also been updated using the March 2024 release of the Ordnance Survey's Open Map Local dataset. Access to nature close to home. Nature close to home aims to understand the supply of publicly accessible green spaces that are likely to be moderate to high in terms of providing opportunity for contact with nature on a regular, daily, and local basis. The assessment buffers green spaces with a minimum area of 0.5 hectares by 300 metres. The assessment focuses on 2 key age groups: the percentage of children and young people under 16 and the percentage of people over 65. It has been updated at a local authority level by using Census 2021 data. Since version 1.2 of the Green Infrastructure Mapping, Census 2021 data has become available for use and has been included throughout version 2.1 mapping update. Access inequalities. The access inequalities mapping looks at the relative disparity between LSOAs when it comes to the levels of access to green space. The measure of accessibility used is the percentage of output area covered by the selected accessible green space standard and attendant buffer. The measure of accessibility is essentially an estimate of proximity to green space, which is then compared with another key indicator of interest. The access inequalities maps have been updated for both index of multiple deprivation and population density for all accessible green space standards. We have introduced new census data and the 2021 issue of LSOAs from the Office of National Statistics. The new ONS release represents an expansion of approximately 900 LSOAs compared to previous maps. Access inequalities, index of multiple deprivation. The IMD access inequalities maps have been updated to use the 2021 ONS LSOAs. However, IMD itself has not been updated. The Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government are working on an update, but it is not yet available. As an interim measure, the version 2.1 access inequalities and IMD map have been assigned interim IMD decile values using lookup tables to join the 2011 LSOAs and the 2019 IMD decile values to the 2021 LSOA boundaries. Further information on how the IMD values have been amended and how gaps in the LSOAs have been avoided is available in the GI mapping method statement. Once the index of multiple deprivation has been updated, these interim values will be revised. Access inequalities, population density. The population density access inequalities also use the new ONS LSOAs. Census 2021 data have also been used to update the population density values. As both population density and LSOA data have been updated, we have not needed to include any interim values. Social datasets. 3 standalone datasets have been provided to add context to the access inequalities data. These are the 2021 population density, 2021 ONS general health, and the 2019 index of multiple deprivation. The ONS general health dataset shows a self-assessment for health ranging from very good to very bad, taken during the 2021 census. The IMD values presented here are the 2019 versions. This allows any LSOA changes made for the inequalities mapping to be identified by reference. Thank you for your time. I will now hand back to Martin Moss, who will take you through the Green Infrastructure Urban Habitat Mapping project.
Okay, well, thank you, David. And it's back to me again, folks, for a little view of modules 11 and 12. Urban habitat mapping. This is new content. We've been developing this for a few years now, and this is the first opportunity we've had to start to publish some of the results. Much of the development work was done for us by a company called 2XL Aviation, and it's taken us a bit of a while to get these ready. So this is the first time for 2.1 that we've been able to publish urban habitat mapping and some of the data associated. So this is largely an Earth observation-based data product using a lot of aerial imagery. What we're trying to do here is to understand what's in the urban ecosystem. I tend to think that as an ecosystem, it probably suffers a little bit compared to others in that there's a bit of a paucity of data, particularly sort of habitat-related data for the urban environment. A lot of habitat interests kind of stop at the edge of town, whereas with this, our interests go from the edge of town inwards. So it's there to support, we hope, going forward, the development of action and strategy around the headline standard for urban nature recovery, sitting within the standard frameworks, and to provide, with a bit of luck, baseline maps and data to help with long-term change detection with respect to the constituency of the urban ecosystem itself. So in terms of structure, it's based on a bespoke system. We designed it specifically to work as an Earth observation product, but also in the urban environment. So there are currently 11 broad urban habitat classes and about 30 detailed urban habitat classes. And like I say, it's designed specifically to work within the built-up area and within urban-related green and open spaces. Doesn't work in the rural environment. If you need to understand the farms landscape, the upland landscape, and so on, then this is not the place for you. There are other data products out there which provide usable information. This is about the town and the city, and within the town and the city. It's a blend of green infrastructure thinking, context, and typology with some habitat style of information. So this is not based on biodiversity action BAP habitats. It's not based on priority habitats either. You can overlay information about those onto the sort of information we get out of this to provide a more detailed context. Some of the classes that we do use are there purely for context. When we get to the edge of town, we don't want to fall off the edge of a cliff. So we provide some very broad information about the nature of the land around the built-up area, but not necessarily what's in it. So the data that's going in is pretty complicated and pretty extensive, but key here is to understand that it's based a lot on aerial photography for a start, so digitizing aerial photography, APGB in particular. But also there's quite a lot of, in fact, there's a fair amount of ordnance survey data, and the significance of that will become clear in a few minutes. But we also add in things like the Environment Agency National LiDAR program data and other bits and pieces to provide context and to refine pixels a little better than we can simply from things like the aerial imagery. So a lot of data goes into this, and what comes out of it is pretty detailed in my view. So in this slide here, we can see, if you look at the arrows in the top picture there, top left, we've got a little green patch at the end of the orangey red arrow, and that points to a patch of grass on the side of the street here, and that's the feature. So that feature there's pretty small, but it shows up in the data, and consequently we get down to some fairly detailed understandings of assets and areas that exist within the urban environment. It's such a sort of fine-grained landscape that we do need something that's capable of peering in there in some detail. And the bottom picture, just to give an understanding of something else it does, is to pick up quite small changes in the texture of habitats. So in this particular case, this open area here is an area largely of grassland. The mapping picks up the trees that you can see, but if you look at the arrow, you can see there are some linear areas interconnecting with each other, creating a little sort of grid of lines. Those lines are paths. They're not formal paths. They're not paved. They're not tarmacked. They're just worn surfaces which differ from that the grass around it by being worn. So the mapping itself is capable of picking up these fine-grained textural details of the urban ecosystem, and it sits within a family of maps that can be used to understand the urban ecosystem itself. So here we have a progression in the top left. This is the green infrastructure assets map, the combined green infrastructure asset map that you will find in module 1, and you'll see there's a lot of grey area there. There are some assets in a sort of a sea of grey. There'd be nothing here, possibly dragons, but there's no green infrastructure. Actually, there is. We know there is, but the data relating to that largely isn't open data. So we can't show you, we can't provide it in the maps that we have, but we know there's stuff there. The Living England mapping, which is kind of in the middle there, is habitat based. It's based on BAP habitats. It covers all of England, not just urban, but we can see that a lot of the urban area is treated as built up and gardens, undifferentiated. So whilst that's useful, if you keep an eye on the top of the map there, there's a habitat mosaic in that largely green area, which corresponds to the purple area in the typology map. That's a public park. So the GI is telling you what sort of a space it is. Living England is telling you the mix of habitats, BAP habitats that exist in that place. And if you go into the following two maps on the bottom right here, the broad and detailed data, And the detail's a bit obstructed by my face, so apologies for that. But the broad detail gives further information about, particularly in that black area, what exists in there, different sorts of assets within there. And the detailed data will drill into not only the habitat mosaic in the Living England data, but indeed the broad habitat data for the urban habitat map, and give a lot of very fine-grained textual information about the content of these spaces. So these maps are complementary. They add context and detail to each other. They can used in combination, or they can be used as standalone data. So on the site, you will see there are two products, open government licensable data products. There is a depiction of the urban habitat map broad classes. It's pixelated and slightly generalized. And it's an image. It's not a sort of. It's not a file of polygons or anything like that. So apologies that. Very difficult to get this into a condition we can publish, but this is kind of as good as we can do. It's nonetheless pretty detailed. I've used it myself locally. I'm quite surprised by some of the detail it's bringing out. But we've also generated what we call the urban habitat mapping summary grid. So using the greenness grid, it aligns with the greenness grid we met in module 1, but it's drilling down to answer that question. If you go back up one slide, and we can't do, that grey area in the urban area where here be dragons or here be nothing, actually we know there is a lot in there. So this information is trying to give an understanding of what could be in there. It's a limited selection of the urban habitats, both broad and detail, with some amounts. And one of the key things to note here is the percent man-made surface comes from the greenness grid, which comes from OS data. That says about 52% of that square is man-made surface. But that doesn't include what's in the gardens as man-made surface. So you'll see there on the list non-vegetative gardens are pulled out. So that 0.39 hectares of non-vegetated garden is the bit which isn't plants, waters or soils, has to be added to the percent man-made surface to give a truer picture of how much of that actual grid square is likely to be man-made surface. So there's a lot of detailed information in here about the constituency of these areas without being able to provide the actual polygons. So the data itself isn't open government licensable. We can't publish the actual maps. There's far too much non-open data in it. However, it is available on request to Natural England, or will be when we've sorted out the arrangements. Nonetheless, in order to access the data, you will have to have the appropriate OS licensing. That's PSGA, public sector geospatial agreement, or equivalent. There are private and academic sector equivalent licensing. We will check. We will have to, if you got the appropriate licensing, we may be able to provide the data to you. If you don't, I'm afraid we can't. We're simply not allowed to. And in terms of coverage in 2.1, it's limited. There's a lot of urban England we haven't been able to map yet. So we are providing maps and data on Tyneside, Greater Manchester, Birmingham Black Country and Solihull, City of Cambridge and City of Plymouth. There's more data on the way, hopefully, for the next iteration, particularly the Liverpool City region, including Warrington, the whole of West Yorkshire and the whole of Greater London. It is still developmental, and it's every time we do some mapping, we do change things. So we are developing it over time. There's room for improvement. There always is, but there's certainly room for improvement, both in terms of method and the output and the sort of decisions we take about how we classify things. We hope by the end of 24/5, we might have something in the region of 30% or so of urban England. It kind of depends on exactly what you classify as urban England, but nonetheless, some 7, maybe 8 or 9,000 square kilometres of data. That's enough of a sample to start asking and potentially answering some questions about what's in the urban ecosystem. We have an aspiration to expand this mapping to cover all at least sizable urban areas. I can't guarantee every bit of urban England will be covered. It's a matter of resources and time, but we will do as much as we can. But before that, we are going to be seeking feedback, probably over the winter, on the work done to date, with a view to developing some form of second iteration method or a slightly improved method. I don't anticipate major changes, but we may be able to improve in some places, and then roll that out over the succeeding few years from next year onwards. So my request is go and play with the data, whether it's the open data or the non-open data, if you can get it, and let us know what you think. So at the end of this particular urban habitat mapping section, we are moving on, and I'm going to hand back over to my colleague Cora, who's going to give us an update on the content of the designated and defined areas module. So over to you, Cora.
I now will talk about Module 18, Designated and Defined Areas. We've updated all designated and defined area maps, which provided for local context, such as identifying protected sites or landscapes, local authority areas, or the location of national trails. We've additionally included World Heritage, battlefield sites, and national character areas in this update. We've also updated the biodiversity and ancient woodland layer, bringing in new sites that have been designated as ancient since the previous version. The existing ancient woodland inventory remains within the layer, but a new layer called the revised ancient woodland is also included. This has the addition of smaller ancient woodlands and also wood pasture parkland data. This project, however, is in development, so it only has Essex, Devon and Warwickshire in the update. However, this will progress within the next year, and hopefully soon will show Lancashire, Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire, Northamptonshire, Dorset and West Yorkshire. I'll now hand over to M. Pope, who will talk about Module 17, People and Nature Survey.
Hi everyone, I'm M. Pope and I'm going to provide a little introduction to Module 17, which is new content from the People and Nature Surveys. So first of all, some background to the People and Nature Surveys for England, which have been running since 2020. The surveys provide evidence relating to people's enjoyment, access, understanding of and attitudes towards the natural environment, as well as effects on well-being and the actions people take to protect the environment. There are two surveys, the Adult Survey and the Children's Survey. The module we're looking at today within the GI map is from the Adult Survey, which is a continuous survey of approximately 2,000 people a month, which equates to around 25,000 respondents a year. The adults data are published quarterly as an accredited official statistic, and a report is published annually. The summary tables and related reports can be accessed on gov.uk, and the data can be accessed on UKDS. So for the GI map, we selected to display results from two of the survey questions, and I'll introduce those in more detail as we go along. The results are presented on two spatial scales, local authority district and local nature recovery strategy areas. It combines the data for the first 3 years of the survey from April 2020 to March 2023. So there is a slight caveat around this, as the survey started during COVID, which might have resulted in different behaviours around how people interacted with green spaces due to restrictions and personal circumstances in relation to COVID. So the first question looks at the perceived change in local green space quality. And for this, we use the question, thinking of green and natural spaces close to where you live, have they improved or reduced in the last 5 years, or have they not changed? And in the map, we display the net perception of change, which is calculated as a percentage of respondents answering improved minus the percentage of respondents answering reduced. And the map shows the results on local authority level. Positive numbers indicate that the percentage improved is larger compared to the percentage reduced, and the darker the red, the more people agree that the quality has improved compared to reduced. And by clicking on one of the local authorities, there's more detailed information, including the sample size, actual percentages for net improved and reduced, and don't know and prefer not to say, along with the confidence intervals. So moving on to the second question that we selected, and this looks at visits to green spaces in the previous 14 days. The metric displayed in the map, here shown for LNRS level, is derived from responses to the question, how many times, if at all, did you make this type of visit to green and natural spaces in the last 14 days? and it shows the percentage of respondents that have visited a green space in the previous 14 days. The darker the red on the map, the higher the percentage of people who have visited a green space. And it's worth noting that results to this question have potentially been more impacted by COVID compared to the previous question on green space quality. And again, by clicking on a particular LNRS, there's more detailed information like the actual percentages, confidence intervals, and sample size. So that's a quick overview of the 2 people and nature survey questions which are on the GI map, and I'm now handing over to Professor Sarah Lindley of the University of Manchester to talk about new content for urban cooling, urban air quality and urban food production. Thanks very much.
Session 7 introduces you to 3 experimental products. They are the provision and need for green infrastructure with respect to heat management, air quality management, and local food. Feedback is very welcome about the usefulness of these experimental products, 2 of which are currently piloted for 1 urban area as an example. The heat management datasets contain the results of an initial assessment of cooling provision from urban green infrastructure and the need for cooling based on climate gradients and social characteristics. Cooling provision is estimated using the INVEST urban cooling model. The model developed for England has 2 parts. It firstly calculates a cooling capacity index based on assumptions about the characteristics of 12 different land covers, and this is based on the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology land cover map product, which in this case has been used for 2020. The characteristics include shading, evapotranspiration, albedo, tree cover and building intensity, all of which have been generated from relevant literature. Secondly, it accounts for the cool island influence of vegetated areas greater than 2 hectares on their surroundings. The output from the model is a heat mitigation index, and this is available at a 250-metre grid and also for lower super output area census units. Assumptions have also been made about summertime rural reference air temperatures and urban heat island intensities across 14 regions based on Met Office climate districts. So the outputs are relevant for summertime periods. On this slide, we can see some of the outputs that are shown in the mapping tool. The cooling provision dataset is an index which runs from 0, which is no cooling, to 1, which is maximum cooling. On the left is an example of an urban park where we can see the local cooling of the park and also its wider influence. The same data have been aggregated to a lower super output area geography and standardised using Z-scores around the English mean. And this basically means that negative values are low, below the average cooling provision, and positive values are high, above the average for England as a whole. You can click on the areas to pull up a summary of data about the areas, including a more precise value or score if that's needed. Turning now to look at the need for cooling data. The need for cooling is based on an existing heat disadvantage data set for England. Heat disadvantage is a combination of social vulnerability to heat and the potential for high temperatures in the future. The social vulnerability to heat index contains over 40 separate indicators grouped into 16 themes, covering population sensitivity, enhanced exposure to heat, ability to prepare for, respond to and recover from heat-related events. So they give you an idea of the potential impacts of heat to local communities. And this was combined with an estimate of exposure to hot weather, here using UKCP18 model outputs for the top 5% hottest summer days under a 3 degrees C warming scenario. And you can see the acknowledgement to the source of that data here. These outputs have been reported at a lower super output area level using the same standardised scale as the LSOA provision scores. So turning to look at the map outputs again, the image on the left shows the need for cooling for the area we previously saw for provision. Relative to the English mean, we can see that the area of high provision we saw earlier has a slightly higher than average need for cooling. So it has a value of 0.253, which puts it slightly above the English mean. By comparing the need for cooling and provision of cooling, it's possible to understand where greening interventions might be prioritised from a heat management perspective. Areas which are darker coloured on the need map on the left and lighter coloured on the provision map on the right might be considered a greater priority. So you can select the area of interest to compare the figures behind the map in more detail. Further information about these data sets, about the assumptions and the validations that have been carried out can all be found in the method statement which accompanies this data release. I'll now turn to look at air quality. The next data sets are about air quality management, and at the moment they are piloted only for Greater Manchester. In these data, we have used PM2.5, that is fine particles with a diameter of less than 2.5 microns, as an indicator of air quality. There are two components of the data set. The first is a provision of air pollution mitigation, the likelihood of PM2.5 removal from urban green infrastructure, and the second is the need for air pollution mitigation, taking account of concentrations and also population health. An overview of the methodology for the provision of PM2.5 removal is shown on the right-hand side of this slide. The provision of PM2.5 removal is based on the UK Natural Capital Accounts assessments. Specifically, it uses data on local authority level habitat-specific estimates of the annual mass of PM2.5 removed from different habitat types. This information was used to derive 7 habitat-specific PM2.5 removal factors. They cover urban woodland, urban grassland, rural woodland, rural grassland, agriculture, wetland and upland classes. The factors, once available, were then mapped to the Natural England Urban Habitat Map product for Greater Manchester, and it enabled an approximate distribution of pollution removal rates to be generated at the 5-metre scale. This is shown on the map on the top left of the slide. The final stage was to aggregate the data to lower super output area level, which allows visualization and comparison with data on the need for air pollution mitigation. The bottom right map shows the standardized scoring system used in the web mapping tool. So this is relative with 0 as the Greater Manchester average and the values relative to that average. So higher provision with higher scores, where the positive scores, and the lower values, the negative scores, being below the average for Greater Manchester. Turning to the data for the need for PM2.5 removal, it has two components. The first represents what we have termed the physical need, that is the concentrations of PM2.5 as an annual mean for 2022, expressed originally in micrograms per cubic metre. These data from DEFRA were converted to a standardised score at lower super output area level. The second component is the social need for air pollution removal, or in this case PM 2.5 removal. It uses the years of life lost as a measure of poor health. Again, this is represented as a standardised score at lower super output area level. And these are shown in the maps that you can see on the screen. The datasets provided enable the standardised scores for provision of PM 2.5 removal and the need for PM 2.5 removal to be compared. For instance, we can see on the left that the LSOA unit that we previously reviewed for heat mitigation also, unsurprisingly, has a fairly high score for provision of PM 2.5 removal too. In this case, the need is around average. So decision makers may wish to prioritise the adjacent area instead, which, although has an average need as well, it has a lower rate of current provision of PM 2.5 removal at around minus 0.729. Again, further information is reported on the statistics in the dataset, or rather the attributes in the dataset, if a particular LSOA is selected. For further information on the method, underpinning data and validation tests, please refer to the method statement. This also provides additional information about limitations and assumptions. The final experimental dataset is the one on local food provision and need. Again, this is provided as a pilot dataset based on Greater Manchester and is a prototype for assessment. The local food datasets have three components. The first is the likelihood of provision of local food from urban green infrastructure. The second is the likelihood of community need for local food, taking account of various social factors. And the final component is the opportunity for local food production, taking account of private garden availability and allotment proximity. And this is basically whether a particular lower super output area zone is near to existing allotments and community gardens, or it might benefit from large private gardens within the area, which might conceivably be used for food growing. The asterisk on this slide denotes that the data for opportunity for local food production are not currently mapped in the Green Infrastructure Map tool, but may be in the future. This slide shows the approach taken to estimating the provision of local food. The provision of local food is based on data derived from the academic literature, primarily studies for Leicester, Cardiff and Oxford. These studies allowed an estimate to be made of the area of allotments, community gardens and private gardens which are cultivated. The estimates were then applied to Natural England's urban habitat map for Greater Manchester using the detail classes. Once the estimates were made, they were finally aggregated to the lower super output area level. The maps on the left give you an idea of what the data look like and what the estimates are, all of which have been mapped to the lower super output area level. The need for local food has been taken directly from the Consumer Data Research Centre, or CDRC, Priority Places for Food Index. This can be accessed online via the address given on the slide. The index contains estimates of the need for local food as a combination of the following components: supermarket and non-supermarket physical distance and accessibility, which is taken as journey time via public transport, access to and uptake of online delivery services, the existence of socioeconomic barriers based on a lack of access to private transport, the amount of family food support in a particular area, such as free school meals or distance to food banks, and then finally, fuel poverty as an indicator of household wealth. and these data are already available at the lower super output area level. This slide shows some of the map's outputs for provision of and need for local food as a score relative to the Greater Manchester average. The map on the left shows areas of local food production, and the map on the right, the need for local food based on the CDRC Priority Places for Food Index. Additional information from the dataset attributes is available for each area. For instance, one of the zones has been highlighted, which shows low provision at minus 0.488, but a high need at 0.727. Here we can also see that the area shown by the arrow is actually quite close to some areas of high provision, in this case due to some existing allotments. Therefore, it could be helpful to reference the opportunity dataset to support decision making. It allows you to assess whether a particular zone is close to existing areas of food growing, or the area is associated with relatively large private gardens. So that concludes the summary of the experimental data sets. I will now hand over to Andrew Thompson of Natural England to say a little more about the next upcoming deep dive webinar. Thank you.
We're launching Module 20, the EBN data support, which is being launched today to coincide with the publication of the updated EBN tool. The link can be found on the right-hand side in the chat. The EBNT module links the Green Infrastructure website with the environmental benefits from nature tool, which in turn highlights the implications of land use change of 18 different ecosystem services. To do this, it requires both habitat information and contextual information about a particular site. That contextual information can now be found on the Green Infrastructure website. This is accessed by using the EBN button, as can be found at the top of the screen. This allows users to draw a polygon around their area of search and then return the supply and demand data sets related to those ecosystem services as used by the environmental benefits from nature tool, providing the attributes required to complete a basic assessment. If you'd like to know more about this module or find out more about the environmental benefits from nature tool, a deep dive is scheduled for Thursday the 14th of November, available to all from Evenbright.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this Green Infrastructure Mapping webinar. My name is David Greenwell, and I'm just going to run us through a question and answer session. We've had questions been coming through in the chat as we've been doing the webinar. But if you have any more questions, then please feel free to add them, and we'll try and get through as many as we can in the time that we've got. We'll try and answer everything, but we may take some questions away if we feel they need a bit more attention, or if we aren't best placed to answer them now. So joining me today are Martin Moss and Cora Hamblin from Natural England's Green Infrastructure Mapping Project. We also have Dr. Anne Marsham from Natural England's People and Nature Survey Project, and Professor Sarah Lindley from the Department of Geography at Manchester University, who's been working on the functionality and needs side of the project. So we will start my questions. I'm going to go and run through these chronologically as they've been coming in. So hopefully we'll get through them all. So we go back to the start. Excuse me. Okay, so the first question we have is on private woodlands. If they've been mapped incorrectly as accessible when they are not, can that be corrected? So I'll pass that one on to Martin to kick us off.
The answer is yes, we can do that. The mapping of accessibility does include a level of uncertainty. So if there is an asset, as it were, that's been mapped as accessible incorrectly, then if you alert us to where that is and you can provide us with a map, then we can look to remove that polygon going forward. So it's possible to do it, yeah.
I'd also say as well, some of our, well, a lot of our input data comes from potential third parties like the OS or forest inventory. So sometimes if there's errors, to get those corrected, we have to go back to the source. So the Ordnance Survey, for example, have an error reporting system. So that's often one way of doing it. Okay, so the next question, and so we've had a few questions from Ben Reed asking about data that we've included, for example, local wildlife sites and local geography sites, geological sites, sorry. And what I'll just say on that is we have a list in the user guide and the method statement on all of the data sets we have included. So if you want to see what we've included, then it's all there. There are some data sets that we would like to include that we haven't been able to due to sort of licensing constrictions. So we have to, well, we publish under an open government license. So for us to be able to do that, we have to, our input data has to be kind of set up for that. So there's a couple more questions about data from the RSPB and the Woodland Trust, for example. This time around, we've not, in the version 1.2, we kind of went out and engaged with the National Trust and various NGOs and people like that to try and get data on permissive access sites. We haven't done that this time around, but I imagine we will do that again in the future to try and include data from more kind of third parties and that kind of thing. I don't know if you anything more to add on that, Martin, or?
No, the National Trust always open data is in the designated and defined areas modules. It's one of the inclusions in one of the maps. The wildlife sites data, a lot of that is not open data, so we can't incorporate it. We don't have it, so it's as simple as that. You know, we try to be fairly inclusive with the designated and defined areas, but it doesn't include everything. They are reference layers, but you know, we can consider adding things in over time.
Yeah, great, thank you. So the next question is, does the garden space differentiate between paved and plastic/turfed gardens and ones that have plants in them? I'll pass that on to Martin.
Yeah, the answer is no. The gardens data we have is derived directly from OS master map, so it's the data provided by the OS, and they map garden space. They don't map what's in the garden, so it doesn't differentiate between the sort of the paved areas and the non-natural surfaces and so on. The urban habitat mapping does drill into that a bit. We do have an ability to identify at least a fair proportion of what we call the non-vegetated surfaces, but there are issues because we use spectral data from aerial photography. So if your plastic is the same color of grass, it has a very similar spectral signature, so it might not pick out your sort of your astroturf. But if it's not vegetated and it's not green, then we're probably picking that up to at least to a fairly decent degree. But the OS data is simply, this is the garden space, not what's in the garden space.
Yeah, great. Okay, so the next question is on public rights of way. So where are you pulling the public rights of way data from? Is that come from each local authority data publishing? And the short answer to that is yes. Yeah, we've gone to, or Cora's been involved in doing a lot of work and going to the two local authorities and trying to get data from them. And that kind of links quite nicely to the next question, which is, if we have data for public rights of way and for parts, specifically in this case for Kingston, can they be added in? And again, the answer to that is yes. Get in touch with us if you've got data you'd like us to include. Then we'd love to have it. There is some licensing that we'll need to go through, but we can, we can include data where we haven't got it.
Just to add to that, if the data that we incorporate into the public rights of way data layer has to come from the Highways Authority, because they are responsible for the public rights of way system. So if it's not Highways Authority data, we can't simply add in general data about paths and things like that, because we need the certainty from the Highways Authority that they recognise it as a right of way, which is why we have gaps on the map. If we can't derive data from the Highway Authority, then we can't be clear on what is and what is not the actual public rights of way network, because it's their responsibility to hold that data, and it's a legal responsibility. It's not just a map of paths. So public rights of way can be quite tricky, but we've done, we've expanded the amount we've got this time round. We are open to offers from other highway authorities if they're out there, but it's normally that the data doesn't exist in the format that we can use and they can't provide it, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so next question is, which Ordnance Survey data are you using as the baseline data for private gardens? Is it the NGD? So at the moment, it's Ordnance Survey Master Map, but I'll pass to Martin just to quickly expand on that.
Yeah, okay, so originally in 1.2 we used the Ordnance Survey premium green space data, which is the non-open green space data. So we can't show you the gardens, we still can't. We can show you statistical maps where how much there is on a unit basis. That covers urban areas, not rural. So we wanted to expand to cover all England. So we've extracted the gardens data out of OS Master Map and then turned it into a statistical map for the whole of England. So that's like step forward from 1.2. But you're right, the Master Map itself is over time going to be replaced by the NGD, the National Geographic Database. And for version 3, which we hope to start in April 2025, one of the things I'm interested in exploring is how we do our own transformation or translation from the use of Master Map towards the NGD, but there are still a lot of questions in my mind about how we're going to be able to do that, but it's certainly on the radar.
Yeah, thank you. So there's a couple of questions here about the access inequalities buffers, and I'm going to kind of roll them into one because they sort of touch on the same area. But essentially, at the moment, the mapping shows straight line buffers for access to green space. Will this be updated to show real-time walking buffers? And as a sort of add-on to that, is it going to include any road and path network data? DEFRA have published access to green space statistic using real-time walking distances.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is the access to green spaced buffers maps, the system of the 6. The buffers we use are straight line buffers, and to be consistent with version 1 2.1 also uses straight line buffers, and so will 2.2. So we have methodological consistency across the versions, and that's important for what's coming again hopefully next year when we start to look at some change detection. So if you change the system radically halfway through, because it gets very difficult to sort of look backwards. On top of that, network analysis, which is what's being presented here, suggested here, it is complicated, and we haven't had the resources to do that. We didn't to begin with, and we still haven't. Now, the work DEFRA are doing and published some first iterations of back in, I think it was August, is to take a much more network analysis based approach. So our straight line buffer doesn't look at any routes. It simply buffers the edge of a space by a set distance, and then it's what's called the as the crow flies method. So you get a zone of proximity, and within that zone of proximity there is a network of routes, and some of them are roads and some of them are paths, and so on. And those are the routes that people use to go from origin to destination, origin being where they live, and destination being the access point to the space that they're trying to get to. And the DEFRA analysis looks at that network in quite broad terms, and also identifies those origin points and the access points themselves. What they did in June was to publish the method. This is how the official statistic might be developed, using a whole range of different data sets, including roads and paths and so on. But then it set out 7 scenarios, which basically say if you have a set of included spaces, a set of included parameters and distances and so on, and you run it through this method, then in scenario 1 you get this output, and in scenario 7 you get a different output. And the scenario outputs range massively. So they're looking at the percentage of households in output areas that are within an estimated 15 minutes walk of an access point to a green resource, not necessarily a park. It could be something else. And the results are massively variable. So they range, I think one scenario estimates about 92%, and another one I think is about 7 or 8%. So there's a huge variation there. And the point now, and DEFRA are seeking feedback, on what's being published, because the real questions are, okay, then what are the parameters and what are the thresholds that should be used in order to develop the official, a final, if you like, official statistic? Because what's there at the moment is incomplete. It's in development. It doesn't look at blue space, for example. We're still working on how to incorporate blue space, but the principles behind the method are set out. Once that has been finalised, what will come out of that is a robust household-based statistic and statistical map that we can start to incorporate into the green infrastructure mapping. And I'm sure it's another data set that we can also start to use, but it's not there yet. It's going to take a bit of time. I don't expect to see anything until sometime in next year. So it's one to watch, but as I've said, it's still a work in progress.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is sort of been answered in the chat by Leanne, but it's just on the People and Nature survey. So I'll come to you, Anne. So can you provide the questions for the People and Nature survey? So Leanne's just posted a link to the annual report, but I didn't know if there was anything else you wanted to comment just on that.
Yeah, I can provide a link to the questionnaire itself if that's helpful. There's a lot of, if you go on gov.uk and search for the People and Nature survey, there's loads of links to like technical report, to the questionnaires, to the data or the annual reports, and then the data themselves can be downloaded from UKDS, and there should be a link to that as well. So if needed, I can provide a link to that gov.uk site.
Great, thank you very much. So the next question is, does access to green space include access to blue space? Are there any plans to include access to blue space in the next update? So I'll pass that on to Martin.
Okay, so if the blue space is within accessible green infrastructure, it's already there. We don't differentiate it. If the pond in the park is part of the park, as it were, so it's not separately identified. But we have identified in the blue infrastructure module, and I'll reiterate what David said. That's currently being updated, so it's a few years old now. But we do look at what we call likely accessible waterside. They could be water bodies or water courses, and I say likely. There's a likelihood it is. There's actually a likelihood that it's not. We can't be absolutely sure. So access to blue space is more specifically articulated in that model. We will be updating it. And as I've said, with respect to the development of the official statistic, that includes blue space. In that it's not exempt, it's not kept out, but we haven't yet worked out how to incorporate it properly because of methodological issues with how the statistic will ultimately be generated. That's being worked on. So yes, it's sort of there in two different ways, and it'll be there in the future in a third way as well. You're on mute, David.
Spotted that, thank you. So the next question is just a kind of general one on the project itself. So how often will this be updated to ensure it stays relevant? So I'll just quickly comment on this. The idea is that we do keep updating this project so we can then kind of use it to assess change. Any other comments on that, Martin?
Yeah, I think it depends on which bit we're talking about. As this thing gets bigger, it also gets scarier and more difficult to update. We can't update everything at once, as I've said. Some of the stuff in 1.2, it's on what we call the shopping list. It's all the stuff we'd like to do if we can get around to getting it done. So some stuff from 1.2 is still waiting to be updated. I think probably some of the material we have is likely to be updated on a more frequent basis than others. So I can well imagine that we will want to be doing fairly frequent updates around all the sort of accessible green space, accessible green infrastructure data. Other products, because they are a significant investment of time, won't be done as frequently. So the urban habitat mapping, for example, we're still developing it. We don't have an urban habitat map for at least most of urban England. So the task there is to get to first base, as it were. And the subsequent question will be, okay, then when and how can we update it? Given the amount of work involved, I can't see that happening more frequently than every 5 years and possibly every 10. It's a significant piece of work, but the intention is that we do keep the content as up to date as we can, and periodically, and we're planning to do this about once every 5 years, we do a change detection exercise. So we look back what's changed between version this and version that, and also try to understand why that change has happened. Is it a change in the data because the data got better, or does it represent, or to what extent does it represent a change on the ground? So we're very interested. We're not just pushing out lots of maps and data We want to know what the trends are, what's actually happening on the ground. And the first attempt to do that, I'm hoping, will be next year, but it will be a few faltering steps forward. We've got to work out how to do it.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll just I'll pass that question to Anne as well, because I imagine the People in Nature survey have their own sort of timelines for updates and changes.
Yeah, so for the People in Nature survey, we do we publish data every quarter, so every 3 months we get new data out. So we could potentially, we already have published another year of data compared to what we've published on the GI map. So yeah, we can definitely update the data with new data literally any time. But yeah, it's every 3 months.
Okay.
There's a new update.
Great, thank you. So I'll take the next question. So in the urban habitat mapping grids, why is the man-made surface presented as a percentage, but the habitat types as an absolute area? So that was simply just due to how we did the analysis at the time. All of those grids are published under an open government license, so the data that's in there is available to anyone to kind of take and do whatever analysis you'd like to do on them. So you can calculate the percentages from the data that's in there. Just at the time when we were doing it, that was what the attributes that we went for. So the question here on how the urban habitat classes relate to the biodiversity net gain metric. So how relatable are the urban habitat classes you're using to those used in the biodiversity net gain metric? From a GI delivery and M&E evaluation perspective, it would be useful if they were aligned.
Yes, there are several reasons why they're not and can't be, because the biodiversity metric uses UK Hab. We don't use UK Hab in the urban habitat mapping. In fact, we don't use it in Living England mapping or NCEA products at this current time. Either it's just not something that we use for the urban habitat mapping, because we're specifically interested in the urban environment and because it's an Earth observation based product. We have designed it around what we thought we had a fair probability of being able to actually identify and marry that to some of the interests we have around green infrastructure, which aren't specifically habitat. So it's a bit of a hybrid, and it is designed to do the job I think that we want it to do. Now, there has been a bit of work done, part of a little bit of pre-release feedback with a particular stakeholder who was interested in this translation between the urban habitat classes and those used in biodiversity net gain. And the feedback we got was, you can do it. It might not be a precise fit, but you can do it. You can translate one into the other. So these things do tend to be translatable to some degree, but we're not using the BNG metric habitat list. A lot of what's in the BNG habitat list, we don't really have a chance of identifying anyway, not with the sort of aerial photography and LiDAR data that we're using. It's just not possible. So there will never be a completely synchro-meshed fit. There's going to be a bit of grating between the two, but you can do it.
Yeah, great. Okay, so next question. Most authorities have their green assets mapped, often for grounds maintenance purposes and things like that. Can we provide you with our GIS overlays to speed up the process?
Speed up the process, I'm not so sure about that, but we can certainly be. We know that most, if not all, local authorities will have their green space strategies and maps and the data associated with that. And I would love to get to a position where, in fact, the mapping that we have is directly informed by data that's coming out of the local authorities, similar to public rights of way. We like to get it from the highway authority because they are the authority with the responsibility for it. So getting green space data from local authorities for the whole of England would be a hell of a challenge. You can talk to Cora about how difficult it was just getting the rights of way data. We struggle to get data on permissive access sites and so on. It requires so much collation. There are hundreds and hundreds of authorities out there. But I would be really interested. A few years ago, I would have said, if we can't do it all England, we're probably not going to do it. And as time's gone by, I've limbered up a little bit. So we can do things in some places because we've got data, and accept the fact that in other places we just don't have data. We can't add things up, which is a bit of a problem. So that hurts our ability to do change detection. but I'd be really interested to see what we could get in terms of data on green spaces, green assets, and so on out of the local authorities for two reasons. One, I'd like to do a comparison with what we've already got to understand. We know there's a lot of stuff in our data that's missing, but we tried to do an estimate of how much that was, and it's the classic. We think about 10% of assets which should be in the data we have aren't in the data for a whole variety of reasons. But it's a bit of it's not so much an estimate as a guesstimate, and I'd love to have some real data to do a comparison with. So if you'd like to give us your green space data, then please do get in contact. We'd like to sort of discuss that, and potentially in the future, one of the other reasons I'd like to have this data is to be able to show what could be done if all local authorities had the ability and the facility to provide this data directly to government, not just to National England. Then that would be a very rich vein of information that we simply don't currently have access to. There's so much data out there which is kept at a local level, but we don't have it at national level. To get it collated into a national data set would be a very significant piece of work. But just having an example of what it could look like if we could would be useful in its own right. So yeah, please get in contact.
Great. So we've had some pretty positive comments on the urban habitat mapping in general, which is nice to read. We've had a question here. I think it might be a little bit outside what we're planning to do with the mapping and the scope, but will the new mapping develop any new UK habitat classifications to capture the uniqueness of space occupied by botanical species that would normally be overlooked?
Jeez, yes. I'd love to. Our first major huge stride forward is to try, as I've said, to get at least most of urban England actually mapped using an urban habitat mapping procedure that we're at least pretty happy with. And it'll never be perfect, but we're still doing, we're fiddling with it at the moment, trying to sort of get it to fit better with what we want to do. I have had an aspiration for some time, the next massive step forward might be to sort of get into an urban species space. How the hell we get there, I do not know. But it's a logical progression once we've got a framework. If you think about the urban habitat mapping, it's basically a framework of a spatial framework that you can use in various different ways. And this whole area of can we use it to understand species or to integrate species data is a very interesting area I'd like to explore. It does feel like we're quite a stride away from being able to do anything, certainly at scale. But it's another one. It's on the wish list. It's on the shopping list. It's on the horizon, maybe. It's not certainly on the radar. I don't know about the horizon. Might be just over the horizon. But I'd like to do it. And I think I saw a question about open habitat mosaic data as well, so I might as well cover that at the same time. In the schema for the detailed habitat classes, so it's not on the site, that's just the broad, but in the detailed habitat class schema, we do have what we call habitat mosaics, not necessarily open habitat mosaics on previously developed land, but something to do with areas of land where there is a complex interaction of different habitats in a fairly restricted space. In undertaking the work we've done over the last couple of years, we didn't come across we didn't come up with a way of being able to identify them satisfactorily. So it's been parked for the time being. We want to do something around habitat mosaics, but the first task there will be to sort of better define what we really mean by that, and possibly a second task then would be to look at, okay, then we do have this data around open habitat mosaics on previously developed land, but it's draft, and it's also, the sites which are identified are massively variable. Some of them probably justify that open habitat mosaic moniker, and some quite probably don't. And I'm not sure to what degree confirming that would actually require an actual survey, which is completely off the agenda. We don't have anything like the resources to do that for the whole of England. But it's possible that we could look at what the urban habitat data is saying about the sites which are identified in the open habitat data, and see what we get out of that. But this whole area of habitat mosaics in the urban environment, they're so important, they really are. But it's a tough nut to crack, and there's still quite a lot of work to do there. But it's another one. It's on the shopping list.
Okay, so we have a question for Sarah. Give Martin a chance to have a glass of water if you need one. Cooling and the need for cooling. Did the locations of where people in the UK have died due to the high levels of heat during heat waves get mapped into this to allow this to be accounted for, to see if there was socio-economic disparity?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's an interesting idea to use that kind of statistic. I mean, what I would say is that at the local level, there's probably going to be an issue with data availability and privacy as well for those kind of data. So we've taken a different approach really by thinking about the potential for harm using social vulnerability to heat as an indicator. So they're things like age and health, building types, income, a whole raft of different indicators there, so individual, social and environmental. So we took kind of that approach and layered on the climate gradient of England as well. So it's, you know, slightly different approach, but hopefully captures you know, what's at the heart of your question about social inequalities in the sense that the social vulnerability to heat does kind of get at that theme.
Thank you. So yeah, while we're on functionality and needs, I've had another question. So is anyone working on modelling and mapping the rural areas where agricultural ammonia and PM 2.5 emissions are likely to make significant contribution to urban PM 2.5 pollution? It'd be helpful for targeting advice to farmers and land managers like we do for protected SSIs.
Yeah, so obviously the experimental work was looking at urban realm in particular, so it was kind of out of the scope to look at rural data. But I mean, I think there's three possible sources of information to help with that kind of decision making. The first is you know, the concentration data really from DEFRA that can be accessed at kind of 1 kilometre level, sources from agricultural sources. So for ammonia and PM 2.5, for example, the natural atmospheric emissions, the National Atmospheric Emissions Inventory is available at 1 kilometre level. So it tells you a lot about sources. So that might be another good source of information for that. And of course, the natural capital accounts do have habitat level pollution removal information as well. So and that's at local authority level. So you know, for each habitat, and closed farmland is one of those, you can have a look at what the information is for ammonia. And I think ammonia and PM 2.5, some of the enclosed woodland, enclosed farmland, data are actually positive, so it kind of gets at what you were talking about there, so that there's a contribution to the, you know, for those pollutants from that particular land cover. So I hope that addresses that question and gives you a few pointers of where you might go for more information as well.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I head back to Martin now. So how will the use of the green infrastructure framework be cascaded to town councils that are targeted for more dense development as strategic spatial areas, with doubling of the housing numbers over that in the current local plan?
This is a question about the broad green infrastructure framework itself, the whole kit and caboodle, as it were. Well, the framework is designed to operate at different levels. It can be adopted, in terms of national policy, but obviously at a local authority level. There's a big focus for us as Natural England on getting local authorities to adopt the framework, but that can also be cascaded down to other geographies, including parishes, towns, individual neighbourhoods, and so on. So I'm not sure. We may have had, I think we've had some interaction at that level, and I think also with the developing nature towns and cities initiative is capable of operating at a town level as well as a district level. So the opportunity to do that is there. As the mapper, we don't target, we're not targeting people in that way, but other aspects of implementation of the framework, both nationally and locally, may well do so.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you very much. So we've got 5 minutes left, so we probably won't get to everyone's questions, but we will go through them and kind of take some away with us. Question here please clarify how to raise errors and omissions in the green space layers. And I think the best way to do that is probably trying to get in touch with the team through the Natural England Have an Inquiries mailbox, and there's an external data services mailbox. So if you contact them, they will eventually get their way to us, and we'll be able to kind of action any requests that come through or investigate and that kind of thing. There's a question here on, are there any plans to make data available on ArcGIS Online / the Living Atlas? The short answer to that is yes. The long answer is we've been trying to do that for some time. There has been kind of internal capacity issues and things like that. It's definitely, as Martin's kind of alluded to, we have this sort of big wish list and shopping list of things that we'd like to do, and getting everything on Arc Online is one of those things. And we're sort of planning on it, but yeah, it's kind of finding the capacity to do it really is the sticking point there. Excuse me, just scrolling through what we've seen. We've been sent some public rights of way data for Nottingham, so that's very nice. Thank you very much. So what is the current status of the Green Infrastructure Framework in planning law, please?
In planning law,
Yeah,
it's not statutory.
Yeah,
the framework
okay.
is not statutory. That's the question. Unlike BNG is statutory, the Green Infrastructure Framework is not. So green infrastructure is referenced in things like National Planning Policy Framework, and that itself is currently going through some changes. So I think we all await to see what emerges out of those reviews. But as a statutory framework, it has no current status in law.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So I think this will probably make this our last question before we wrap up. But so there's an incredible amount of information on the mapping platform, which will be useful for local plan evidence and other strategies. Will local authorities be able to generate reports on the data for their area either now or in the future?
Yes, you can. I mean, the data itself is it's a bit unfriendly, I'm afraid. We'd like to make this easier to do. But all the data that you see on the site is OGL. It's available, open government license in the download geo package, geo database. As I've said, I think we've got a problem with the package, but it will be there at some point in time. So you have to download the whole England package, as it were, but then you can cut out the patch that you're interested in, and you can run your own reports. You can interrogate that data and extract the numbers from it, how much you've got of what and where it is, and blah blah blah, to your heart's content, and then feed that into whatever process that's relevant to, whether that's local plan or other forms of strategy. So access to data, you're going to need a nice friendly GIS person to tap on the shoulder and say, can you do this for us, please? But I know that can be a problem, but yes, it can be done.
Thank you. So I'll just cover the last question. Will this webinar be sent out as a recording? So this is going to go up on the Green Infrastructure Framework website as a training resource. So it'll be there for anyone who needs it. So as I said, if we've not got to any questions, we'll go through and we'll try and get back to anything we've missed. So it just remains me to say thank you for joining us, and I'll now just hand over to Martin to wrap up.
Okay, so in the final minute, I'm left with doing all the thanks. There are too many to fit into a minute. I'd like to thank all the presenters to start with, my co-presenters here, for being here today and producing the materials that we've gone through. I'd like to thank everyone over the last 2.5 years who's been involved in developing the content, creating version 2.1. It's been a beast, believe me. There's an enormous amount of work behind the scenes in this, and I can't list everybody, but a huge thank you to them. I'd like to specifically thank colleagues for making this event happen today, behind the scenes, working very frantically, particularly Chloe and Leanne, who you don't see, but they are there making sure that you can see the rest of us. And then finally, I'd like to thank all you for joining us on this event, and I hope that's been of interest, and I hope you'll find version 2.1 of use. I'd like to thank you until next time, which could be possibly spring, summer next year, when we're launching, hopefully, version 2.2. But until then, this is, as they say, Radio Natural England signing off. So thank you and goodbye.